Yeah, I don't know how you've been feeling, David, but I've been feeling extremely luxurious, super luxurious, you
Mm.
might say. Um, Particularly because the luxury consumer markets are just, they're doing really well, and that's a thing I like to keep an eye on to see how the economy's doing.
They're blowing up, man. I mean, it's a good time to be a billionaire, and the people who have been doing well have been doing really damn well. I think we fall back on this stat a lot, but you just need to keep on harking on it. That since the pandemic began, March 2020, the total combined wealth of American billionaires has increased from 2.9 billion, 2.9 trillion to $4.7 trillion. Um, I'm sorry, you get confused sometimes because it just is a kind of mind-boggling sum of money. But there are a lot of people who not only uh, didn't suffer during these past year and a half, 2 years, but they did better than they've ever done before.
Well, I mean,
And I
yeah,
think
it's
that's what
the way Jeff Bezos has been picking up shifts, for
yeah,
letting.
yeah, Jeff Bezos been manning the lines, making sure the packages get out in time. No, he's been dicking around and working on going on to space, and that should be the kind of poster when we remember 2021 is that there's a class of people who really are living on a completely different planet than the rest of us.
Yeah, so this prompted a tweet thread of mine. Started off, this was prompted sort of by national debt concerns that we'll get into with Manchin in a little bit. One thing we could do if the national debt ever starts having negative effects is to take money from rich people and pay for it. There's a yacht market, there's a money tree, and then look at the like. This is just if you Google luxury. Luxury sales turned in an unusually strong first half this year. Can the good times last? The good times, I love that. The good times when luxury markets are doing well. I like the caption here: person wearing a luxury suit in a luxury home. Um, we also have luxury watch sales surging as Britons go on spending sprees. Luxury market update: sales increase. Bald head home study sales. Global super luxury sales surged in the first half of 2021, and luxury branded condos entice buyers even with no hotels. So yeah, luxury. The times are good.
Times are really good. I mean, that's the thing is, so much of the American markets, I'm honestly, for the past couple of decades, have really been focused on super high end products. Like, not just from the kinds of things like, stuff like golden toilets, but, $80,000 pickup trucks. I mean, it's pretty wild to realize the different world that a lot of these folks are living in.
Yeah, like unable to really spend the money and yeah, buying
Yeah,
properties.
they're unable to spend the money, so it's like, who cares? It's not something that they really have to worry about it, which is why it's so ridiculous to that we're starting to hear all this rhetoric that we need to start tightening our belts as a country.
Yeah, so I mean maybe that's a good way to we get into this Bidenflation stuff, David.
Hmm.
I mean, I have cavalierly as somebody with a substantial amount of student loan debt might do, said inflation is good because that will inflate away my student loan debt. Um,
Hmm.
Now, we have this political article here that we want to talk about. Um, and so I guess like my cavalier tweet meets reality a little bit. Who does inflation hurt in America, and does it have to be that way?
Well, I mean, the thing is that inflation, it's one of those statistics or ways of like looking at the economy. I'm just like talking about inflation in general that can sometimes miss the mark, right? Because what really matters is what things are like the prices inflating out of control, right? Um, and there's some truth to what you're saying, Matt. Like, for most people, if you don't have a lot of money sitting around in the bank, the fear of inflation sort of erasing all of your savings isn't really as strong as it is for super wealthy folk. And it's certainly beneficial for somebody like you and for like me, who is in debt, right? If the total value of what your debt is essentially going down because of rampant inflation, that could be a beneficial thing. But yeah, it's like you don't want to sit around and be cavalier about this because inflation is extremely damaging to society. I mean, just literally from the kind of on a basic level of just stability, right? If you're going to the store and the next, you go to the store and you buy something that costs $5 one week and then it costs $7.50 the next week, all of your interactions start to get very, very difficult. We've seen horror stories in South America, for example, where they're just not even able to update prices on the grocery store shelves because there's just such rampant inflation. But we're nowhere near that in this country. And instead, inflation gets to be a kind of boogeyman, right? And typically, when you start hearing the ruling class talk about inflation, what they're talking about is they want the federal government to start disciplining labor and to start making sure that working class people don't have more money in their pockets. But let's get some things straight. Like, there have been huge increases in things that Americans buy: cars, used trucks, guns, lumber, and houses, even food. The prices of those things have gone up dramatically in the past few months and year. I'll tell you one thing: there's a very basic explanation for that. It's the pandemic. There were massive crises in supply chains. Some of these things have not really been reckoned with. Think about something like the used car market, right? Typically, in the used car market, there's a massive influx every year of rental vehicles that basically get sold, right? And that increases the entire supply of used cars that are in the market. Well, when people weren't really driving around and renting cars for a year, that meant that entire fleets basically were sitting on the lot, right? Which means that there's a huge part of the used car market that usually comes in, a huge supply of used cars that usually comes into the market that did this year, right? That's not the only reason the used cars have gone up, but it's just one of the examples of like all the different ways that the pandemic really affected prices. Um, Inflation is a really tricky beast to tame. It's not. It's also not something that people on the left should ignore. Its causes aren't always super easy to identify. But as I was just saying, the pandemic had a huge influence. Years and years and years of reliance on what was called the just-in-time production system, which meant that things literally were just showing up right as they were needed for production, meant that there became a lot of issues with sourcing the materials that are needed for producing lots of different goods, that we use. Our friends and gamers who are listening to this, I'm sure, know plenty of examples of that using computer parts, but obviously that is going off, occurring all across the American economy. The lockdowns really made things wild. And lastly, remember, people really did change their habits because of the pandemic in ways that we haven't really had time for that to change the way that we're producing things, right? A lot of people became DIY, part-time DIY handymen in their houses, which is a big reason why lumber and things like that have skyrocketed in price. I mean, a great example of this, remember what the hell happened to flour? When the pandemic first started, all these people were acting like they were going to become bakers at home. And a lot of these things ended up just being wasted, particularly because the people who have been able to buy up a lot of stuff for the past year and a half have been the relatively privileged few who have been work from home people, which has just meant that there are some things in the economy right now that the prices are wildly high on, right? And other things it's not as strong. So this kind of general narrative of price inflation in the U.S. economy, I think, is a scare tactic that is being used as a bludgeon for more sinister reasons that we'll get to in a second. And if we have this Politico piece up, I think this really highlights the problem here. Price. This is, I think, from this morning, Politico. Price growth is winning the race. Inflation is devouring wage gains. New data shows inflation jumped again in July as price hikes overshadow the benefits of wage gains. We'll go down here. This first paragraph is all that really matters. Rising prices on everything from groceries to gasoline have eaten away the wage gains workers have seen since the start of the year, leaving most Americans earning less than they were before the pandemic began, and derailing the White House's argument that paychecks have grown under Joe Biden's tenure. Prices climbed 0.5% over the month from June to July, a slower pace than in recent months, but still sizable enough that it outpaced the healthy wage gains the healthy wage gains workers across the income spectrum have received. As a result, real earnings decreased 0.1% over the month, government data shows. And this is really notable, I think, to make this point that the kind of inflation that we are seeing is eating into the some of the benefits that workers have received. But let's not forget that they even laid out at the beginning of that paragraph. The White House has argued that their number one goal is not to increase the wages of American workers, right? That has not been the policy. They might try to, sell it in some ways to some people, but when they're talking to, reporters, they're saying something very different in their pitch, which is that they're just trying to get the economy rolling again, not to see some kind of massive shift that would happen if we were basically pushing forward higher minimum wages
Right.
and things of that nature.
These are
And let's
choices that they didn't, right? They decided not to pursue the higher minimum wages because they're trying to coerce labor. That's what get the ball rolling means.
that's I mean really, like, that's what this is all about. At the end of the day, is that there were a lot of things that might have created and sort of amplified this moment of increased prices, right? Notably, the fact that people were getting more money sent directly to them for the first time in many people's lives, right? And that was a good thing, and they should have been doing that more, right? But what's happening right now is there was not this kind of structural reshuffling and redistribution of power in the workplace, or higher wages that were going to last through inflation, right, for American workers. Um, there were temporary injections of cash, which again were good, and we needed a hell of a lot more of that, right?
Yeah.
But that is a reason why people were able to spend a little bit more. Well, what we're seeing right now is this clamoring and this demanding that there's tightening, right? Which is why you and I have been making this point on the show from the get-go, that one thing you really need to notice about the Biden administration is that they're not making things permanent, and they're not doing things that are going to have lasting structural benefits for American workers. They're doing kind of temporary influxes of cash, and everything with sunset provisions, right? Basically things that will go away in a few months. And that has created a really, really dangerous situation for American workers.
Yeah, I mean, this is the joke we used to make back when Yang was running for president about landlords for UBI, right? Like
Yeah.
in the absence of any kind of structural changes where you decommodify these essentials, it's nice to give money away, but it's immediately going to get soaked up by rentiers.
Yeah, and look, I mean, look at some of the major benefits. Like we've talked about, the direct payments, right? That's good. Child tax credit, that's great too. That should be made permanent and expanded. But then look at other things. We got the eviction moratorium, not rent forgiveness, student debt freeze, not cancellation, right? That is an example of the temporary nature of a lot of these programs, right? That does not set up working people to be stronger as a class in the long haul. And the reason that this is really critical that we don't get lazy about this talking point is that this kind of little uptick in inflation is now being used as an argument for why we need to start tightening the belt, right? That things have gotten too good for working people, that people are lazy right now because they're getting too many benefits, that the economic consequences of the pandemic have all but have pretty much been solved, right? That's not true at all. People are seriously struggling, and if what happens out of this is higher prices for goods, right, and then wages gains that just completely get eradicated in that, we will be in a worse off situation. And to highlight this point of what it's like for most working people in this country right now, and why it's so ridiculous that you're seeing people like Joe Manchin starting to push back against spending initiatives, if you could pull up this SNAP map. Thank you. SNAP is something that's personal to me, right? As the product of that program, that was the program that put food in my belly. This is something I think some people don't have connections with, and they don't realize how damaging these failures are. So this map right here is before they put in a 15% increase as a part of pandemic responses from the federal government, from Congress, right? And what the blue represents are areas where there is a gap between a SNAP benefit and the cost of a meal. And just so people know, when they're talking about a cost of a meal for an individual with these calculations, we're not talking about, Chipotle or something like that. It's around $2.41 a person, right? This is not luxury. It's cruel already. But if you look at this map, you can see how many people, even with the SNAP benefits, were not able to use those to afford the full price of a meal. Now, this is what happened with the pandemic. They increased that 15%. If you could just click that little button there, you'll see that while a few areas saw some increases, many, many, many didn't. Um, in basically covering the gap between SNAP benefits and the increases in the price of a meal. And this is also something you know when you're reading this map. It's like the same thing when you look at an electoral map. There are parts of the country where a hell of a lot of people live, and there's also lots of parts of the country where there aren't a lot of people. And big parts of the yellow parts of the map are more rural areas. And if you look at those areas too, we're not seeing the huge discrepancies. No one's buying nice stuff with this. Again, we're talking about $2.41 a meal, right? So again, these benefits, if I recall correctly, are set to expire in just a couple of months as well, right? There's been a complete failure in this society to provide for the people. And what we've seen from the Biden administration is, these small little tweaks around the edges, but it's inadequate. It's sunsets. And to start talking like we've sort of solved the problem or we're close to it, and now it's time for austerity to tighten our belt, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, just this morning I heard the bodega guy explaining the hot food sort of regulation. I mean, if there's like a reason to storm Congress, for instance, it's that just malicious disdain for people, like just demeaning, like no reason for it.
And the evil of it, like for
Yeah.
people, like, it depends on where you live, right? But if you grew up in, poor areas like me, when you go into the Walmart, they have, the rotisserie chickens, right? And they're hot.
Mm,
But you'll notice they'll have a couple in the fridge section that are cold. But why would you want that? Well, it's because you won't be able to get it if the temperature is too high. I mean, one of the most absurd and demeaning aspects of our system, and that's a whole other conversation about how inefficient our system is in the first place. But we're at a point right now where it's just underfunded.
right.
Um, and I know we have folks we want to get to, but there's 2 points we wanted to make here. One is just remind people about what's happening for working people. There's another story that should be noted, that we're seeing record levels of dropouts at community college in the United States. And that's a really good indicator. I mean, it's a horrifying indicator, but it's an indicator that really shows what's happening with working class members of American society. They're saying that they're unable to basically maintain, the kind of workload that comes with doing coursework and with working full time in the U.S. during the pandemic. We should note, and I know you wanted to note about this too, right? That we really are living in different worlds, and not only just financially, but geographically. It's interesting to see, like, obviously some of the most unequal parts of the country are places like New York City. I mean, you can see that, right? But a hell of a lot of rich folks have absconded up into Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pull this article up here. What I find so fascinating about it, I saw a TikTok a while ago about how rich people are like they have like these plane communities where they like fly into town after being, oh come on, Business Insider. Um Business Insider's giving me an ad block treatment. I gotta get through that. Okay, yeah, here we go. But yeah, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I mean, I don't know if I've been into Wyoming. I've seen Devil's Tower, but not this stuff. But yeah, wealthy people are flying to Jackson Hole.
Yeah.
I need to find this TikTok. If you have something to say on this, of these rich people flying in, that I forgot
No, I
to
mean
look up
it's
footage.
horrible. I mean, for people who are from Wyoming, what that does is it creates this absurd situation of price inflation. I mean, housing is one of the most extreme examples of this, right? That most working people can't even buy a home, is sort of like, that's antiquated at this point. Most working people, we can't even dream of owning something, and that's becoming a sort of universal aspect of being an American now, right? We've gone from the dream of the white picket fence, every person gets a home kind of idea, to the realization that that's only for rich people. And when you have this kind of influx of billionaires, you get what Matt opened up the segment talking about, these insane luxury markets, right? So they stop building affordable housing for people. People have to leave, parts of the country that they've lived in for generations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it really is like like Peter Thiel sort of like seasteading fantasies about escaping society. Like before that happens, they are just going to take over some of the most beautiful places in this country with sort of like Elysium neighborhoods that they
Yeah.
like are only accessible by private jet.
No, and No, I mean it's frightening, and you can really, I mean, this is America really is becoming clearly a class society. And before we go and bring it on Bessner and Davison, I did want to make the point about Manchin and why this kind of austerity religion is so damaging, right? So they're already getting worked up about inflation, right? You're already seeing Biden is starting to retreat on these things and starting to try to make excuses for people who are basically demanding more and more austerity. And then you have the hammer of the Democratic Party, Joe Manchin, right? And Sinema. These folks who, again, it's worth noting, they're the public faces of this opposition, right? But they're shielding their people. They're shielding members of the Democratic Party as they do the will of the super rich in this country.
Joe Biden. I mean, they're definitely
And Joe
shielding
Biden,
Joe
yeah.
Biden. You look at the Delaware senators; they're lockstep with Manchin and Sinema. You don't hear about him as much because it draws too close of a line to the guy who's really the impediment, which is Joe Biden.
Yeah, and what Manchin does and what a lot of Republicans do is they hold tight to this rhetoric that makes a lot of damn sense to anyone who has ever managed a family budget, to anyone who's a working person who's had to make those kind of decisions at the end of the week, what you can and cannot afford, right? Which is that when things are tight, you got to buckle up, right? But that is wrong. It's wrong as advice to give to a country. And if you have this clip here, Matt, I think Yanis Varoufakis, the left-wing economist and former member of Syriza, I think really outlines it well here when he gets confronted with this kind of rhetoric when he's doing a question time bit.
Economics is really simple. I've got £10 in my pocket. If I go out and buy 3 pints of beer in Cambridge, I'm probably borrowing money. If I carry on doing that, then I'm going to run out of money and I'm going to go bust. It's not difficult, guys. Just sit down, work out what the country needs to do and work collectively
because the
together.
Country does not operate as your budget does.
We have a budget.
But why not? Why not? Why
in
not?
the country, total expenditure equals total income. In your life, you have a wonderful independence between your expenses and your income. So when you cut down on your expenses, your income doesn't cut. It's not cut. But for the country as a whole, if the country as a whole goes into a major savings spree, then its total income is going to come down. So your personal life is not a good model on which to base that.
Yeah, and I think that he puts it really well there, and I think it's a good rhetorical bit too, because like you just have to deal with those simplistic analogies simplistically, right? The fact is that austerity killed. It killed people in this country. It killed people all across the West when this became the dominant mode of governance, right? And what we're seeing from the federal government, both under Trump and Biden, is not austerity. So why is there this push right now to like go back to the old playbook, right? To go back to the budget, the old school budget kind of analogies. Well, it's not because they want to go back to austerity again, right? It's this fear that if the money goes a certain way, that it's going to have fundamental changes to the U.S. economy. What do I mean by that? We opened up this segment with the fact that not only have the rich got richer, this is a world historic transfer of wealth. This is a world historic concentration of wealth in a few people, and you see it in the kind of over the top stuff like the space travel from the Bezos and the Musks, right? But you also see it from all of the luxury markets too that Matt was pointing out, right? There are a lot of people at the top who have too much damn money, and we spent a lot of money trying to make sure that they were taken care of during this crisis. And they did that through making sure that asset prices not only stayed stable during a global pandemic, but that they actually increased in value. They did it through direct cash influxes and a lot of other moves by the federal government and the Federal Reserve that basically operate under a logic that the taps go one way, as Mark Blythe says, right? We don't have a system in this country to pump money into the into the pockets of working people, or at least it's not accepted as political rhetoric, right? And why are people like Manchin and Sinema and the Biden administration secretly trying to shut down this kind of demand for the government to do more to make sure that people are taken care of as this pandemic continues to rage on? It's because they are afraid of a fundamental shift, of a fundamental redistribution of power and money in this society. They want to discipline labor, and they want to get everybody to go back to work, and they want to make sure that you're going back to work, not only for the paltry wage that you were making before the pandemic, but likely for even less. Biden has already shown that he is much too ready to accept these bad faith criticisms from the right and the rich, and we just can't let them get away with it right now.